Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA. I also have another channel on YouTube called Relationship and Truth in case you're interested, but this channel is a gun channel. And it is a gun channel from a Reformed Christian worldview. And so that being the case, I'm going to start out with a reading from Scripture. I'm going to be reading from Psalm 18, starting in verse 37, going down to verse 42. All right, so Psalm 18, starting in verse 37. The text says, "I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and did not turn back till they were consumed. I thrust them through, so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me I destroyed. They cried for help, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire of the streets." Thank you very much for listening to the Word of God. This is something that I do on a great many of my videos, not every single one of course, but a great many of my videos. I begin with a reading from the Word of God and I talk about it a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do here. That particular passage was of course a part of a larger psalm, and it was particularly a psalm of David. He was one of the kings of Israel, and like many of the kings of Israel, especially the early ones, he was a warrior. The nation of Israel was under attack and has been under attack numerous times, and God would often save Israel through the means of warriors. Yes, warriors are a means that God uses, and it is entirely within God's right to do so. There is kind of a strange notion out there that God is for everyone equally. That's not true. Those who are not righteous, who have no respect for God's law, who are in rebellion against God's law, so on and so forth, are not people that you would expect God to be super happy with. And that was the case of the nations that Israel displaced in the Promised Land, in the land of Canaan. God even specifically said, even way back in the beginning, when all this was happening, he told Abraham, the forefather of the Israelite nation, he told them that the wickedness of these people is not yet complete, and that's why I'm not going to bring your people into this land quite yet to truly possess it as a nation, like you're going to eventually, but you're not doing it yet because their wickedness is not yet complete. Saying that, I'm going to hold off on doing this until it actually gets pretty bad. God is patient, and yes, God is kind, but he does not tarry forever. And there does come a point where evil gets to a point where it can no longer be tolerated. Okay, there's a great wisdom in being tolerant up to a point, and then that wisdom that is intolerance becomes the stupidity of accepting outright evil. And that is one of the points that a Reformed Christian such as myself has to take into consideration. There's lots of instances in our everyday lives where people do stupid things and even evil things, but they're not necessarily worth fighting about. Take in the New Testament some of the things that Jesus would say to his disciples. He'd say, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the left as well. Striking someone in the face, and in that context would be understood to be an open hand slap, not getting into a fist fight someone, but understood to be a slap. If someone slaps you, yeah, that's an insult, but it's something that you don't necessarily have to fight over. Okay, if the worst you're going to do to me is slap me, all right, I can take it. Want to try again? Okay. There are things like that we see throughout the Bible of, there is definitely a virtue in a tolerance that is willing to overlook certain things. Not to say that they're right, but to determine what is worth fighting for and what isn't. And making sure that you can tell the difference between the two is a pretty important thing. And the Bible is always clear about making it clear that there is, in fact, a difference. So you have David, who's the king at the time that Israel is still kind of in its infancy. It's been around for a while, but it's still kind of young, especially as a kingdom. He's literally the second king that Israel has ever had. And so, yes, the kingdom is still very young and becoming established in that sense. And so it's not any great surprise that he has a lot of difficulty in his time, and there's a lot of warfare in his time. But how it began all the way back with Abraham, and how we also see it being reiterated with Christ in the New Testament, is that just because someone is evil in and of itself doesn't mean that it's your privilege to destroy them. There's a reason why the Bible says it is mine to avenge, says the Lord. But nonetheless, it's still a fact in biblical history that God still does use warriors. And it is obvious in that context that there is a point where God says enough, and he calls on particular people to make the difference. And those are questions that all of us have to struggle with. And I'm not going to get into that a whole lot because I want to get into the gun side of it. But those are things that we all have to struggle with. And hopefully wisdom that we all understand is that not every offense, even though it may be truly evil, not every offense is necessarily worth killing over. But even biblically speaking, there are some that are. And that is something that everyone who's a Christian who takes the Word of God seriously is going to have to come to terms with, and make sure that they understand those issues and understands what God's law has to say in the particulars of how you deal with these kinds of things. All right, enough about that. Let's go ahead and get into the gun side of it. And by the way, when I say enough about that, I'm not saying we don't want to deal with that anymore. I'm just saying that that suffices for a discussion, suffices to provoke the thoughts that I wanted to get people thinking about. Okay, I'm not trying to dismiss it anyway. I'm just saying that's enough to get the point across. These are things we need to think about. All right, as to the gun side of it, I wanted to talk today about what I think about CZ as a company. And that's CZ as a company. They are the very first kind of handgun that I ever bought for myself. And I happen to have it here, and by the way, all of these guns have been checked and cleared. Okay, so they are clear, they are completely empty, but this is the very first gun that I ever bought for myself. This is a CZ75 Compact, and this is actually a pretty nice little gun. And anyone who knows me, who knows why I got into shooting in the first place, my primary purpose of use with pretty much all of my guns, even now, although I've diversified a little bit more, but my primary purpose of use is and kind of has always been recreational. I don't really like handguns. Everyone who knows me knows that handguns are not a strong preference of mine. Handguns are kind of a necessary tool, a necessary self-defense tool. It's much more practical than carrying around a rifle or a shotgun or something like that. So it's a tool, and in that sense I practice with them, I train with them, try to be halfway decent with them. But they're not super fun for me. So when I went out to buy my first handgun, I wanted something that would be somewhat enjoyable as a handgun can be for me to shoot. I wanted it to be enjoyable. So went to the gun store and I said, okay, this is the price range that I was looking at the time. I wanted a handgun between $500 and $600, and I wanted it to be a 9mm. And the reason why I wanted 9mm is because 9mm is cheap. If you're going to do something for recreational purposes, you want it to be inexpensive. Okay, a recreational gun that is, like $3 per round, like a BMG, 50 BMG that is, not a great recreational gun. It might be fun to shoot. That might be very true, but it wouldn't be fun to shoot multiple times just because it's going to hurt your bank account. And so I picked 9mm because it's a very inexpensive centerfire round, but still gets the job done in terms of recreation, and it's viable for self-defense, and that's what I went into this thing with, is primarily recreational, fairly cheap to shoot, but in a self-defense situation could get the job done if it needed to. That was secondary, but I still wanted it to be capable of that. And so the fellow at the gun store actually showed me quite a few different guns, most of them Glocks, but he also put this up on the counter. And I'm looking at all the Glocks, and I don't like them, and they point kind of weird, all those kinds of things. And I start messing around with this thing and holding it, and it's got some weight to it, which is good, because that means it's going to be more enjoyable out on the range. It's not necessarily a great carry gun, but it is more enjoyable out on the range, because more weight in the gun means less felt recoil for you. That's a good thing. I like that. And it's also really just super comfortable, especially as a one-handed gun. If there's any gun that I have and that I've ever shot one-handed that's actually comfortable one-handed, it's definitely this gun. It just, the contour on it is great. And this is not any special grip or anything. This is just the stock factory grip that's on it, little plastic screw-on thing. But it is an extremely comfortable grip. And so that definitely got me thinking about it. I was like, well, that feels pretty nice. It's heavy, so they're not going to be super hard on recoil. And then on top of that, it also had a safety on it. And at the time, I was still fairly new to guns, and so I was really adamant that everything had to have a safety. And that's still not a bad rule. But for defensive guns, you'll learn that having a safety on is actually kind of an impediment to your own safety, because it's one more thing that you have to do before you defend yourself, and lost time is possibly lost life. So not always a great thing, but with training you can get around it. But had a safety on it. And then the slide itself, and this is actually typical of pretty much all CZs, rides pretty high in the frame, which means I can actually get a really high grip on the thing. Basically, my hand is literally just below the barrel. My hands are just below the barrel. I can get a really nice high grip on it. It also has a little pad on the front of the trigger guard, so I can wrap a finger around it real good. And I can get a solid grip on that gun, and a nice high grip on the gun to be able to control it. And with that finger grip out front, be able to hold that muzzle down so I don't get too much muzzle flip. And yeah, Glocks have a little pad out there that you can do that with, but not nearly as comfortably. And also, I like the trigger on this thing. This trigger is very reminiscent to me of a revolver trigger. And I actually like revolver triggers. I'm not a big fan of revolvers at all, but I like revolver triggers. And this thing definitely reminds me of that. And it's single double action. So, hammer all the way back. I'm not going to dry fire it right now because this one's kind of in a incomplete state, we'll say. Some of the guts in the slide have been taken out because I'm in the process of upgrading it. Well, repairing and upgrading it. And I'll talk about that in a second. But all the way back, single action, pull the trigger on it. It's not bad. And when you do that on this one, it feels kind of like it's somewhere in the 4 to 5 pound range. Not bad. And then to put it into double action, let the hammer come forward to the semi-cock position. And yeah, you do have to fire it on this one to do that. But that makes the trigger a lot stiffer. Finally, you can get it to go off, and it's not going to ruin anything if I do that. I just don't want to do that too much with the guts out of it. But yeah, it works. And for the longest time, this was the only handgun that I owned, and I really wasn't interested in much more than that. And because it's heavy, I didn't really carry it that much. I've actually carried a little bit more. In a pocket, it's not bad, and because it's double action, I can carry it in a pocket pretty well and feel very safe that way. But I've tried doing in waistband with this one, and the problem I have is that pretty much any holster that I've tried, and haven't tried a ton, but any holster that I've tried with it, I'll have pretty much the same problem, in that the back end of the gun usually isn't covered by the holster. And it's got this little tank here, which is great when you're shooting it. Gives your hand a nice rest for your hand, keeps you away from the slide and everything like that. It's terrifically safe that way, and I do like that about CZs. This slide always is pretty high, keeps it away from the hand, allows you to get a really nice high grip. It's good for that, and having the tang on the back there, a little beaver tail, is nice and comfortable, and it keeps it from kicking back too much. But when you go to carry it, that little tang, if you don't have it covered up, it digs into your side. It doesn't feel overly pleasant. As far as the overall size, it's not bad. This is about the same size as a Glock 19, which is, it's a manageable size, but it is heavy. It doesn't have that tang on it. But this was my very first sidearm that I ever owned. And I actually liked it a lot, and I still like it a lot. I've kind of banged it up some here and there and pretty much everywhere. Tried to drift the sight, because the sight on this one is a little bit off. Over close distances it's not going to matter, but when you start going out there, it starts to matter. And I tried to drift it. It didn't drift. I moved, it didn't move. So yeah, that didn't work out too well, but overall, still a very good gun. And this one wound up being like $520 before taxes in my area. And I'm in southern Idaho, for those of you who may not know. And it's actually a terrific little gun, has some really nice features for it, and has served me very well. Now, granted, you do have to be careful about how you carry it because of that tang, getting a holster that somehow covers that so it's not digging into you all the time, or carry it in a place where it doesn't matter, like in a pocket. And I have carried this thing in a cargo pants pocket with a little sleeve over it to protect the trigger area, and that works just fine. But this was my very first handgun. It was a CZ, and I picked it mostly just because of ergonomics and some of the secondary features that I noticed. It has a fairly high slide, so I'm not going to get a lot of slide bites. It does have a safety on it, which at the time I felt was very essential for every gun to have. Now, especially understanding, double single action operation, I'm not such a big nut about that, but it's a feature. Decent trigger pull and all those kinds of things. Not great, but decent. It'll do. And another thing that was going in my head at the time, I actually originally wanted to get a 9mm Jericho. I think that was a model 941, if I remember right. And gun store didn't have any in stock. They're actually pretty hard to find and to turn out. And the reason why I originally wanted a Jericho was to go with my IWI Tavor X95. That was in 9mm. X95s don't usually come in 9mm, but I got one that was converted over to 9mm. Actually, I think it was from the factory 9mm, but it's still not super typical. Usually when you see a Tavor, they're usually 5.56. But they do make 9mm, and they also make 300 blackout for them. But that's off topic. Anyways, it was an IWI product. I wanted something else that was an IWI product because I liked my Tavor. It was high quality. It works very reliably. Good gun. Want something else from them. Well, I couldn't find the Jericho, but I do know that the Jericho was based off of the CZ75. And this was the compact model, so I said, hey, why not? And it's still with me to this day. And given that I didn't really like handguns very much at all, especially to begin with, and I still don't really like them that much, but especially to begin with, it was something that I put off on the side and check the box. Yes, I have a handgun. Okay, moving on. But as time went forward, I started taking concealed carry and those kinds of things more seriously. And so I eventually decided, I want something that's going to be a little bit better and a little bit more capable and also hold more rounds. Now this one with the standard magazine capacity on this one is 14 rounds. And you can get the extended base plate model, which I actually had. It came with the gun that holds 15 rounds, so it's not bad. It's not a slouch. But I decided I wanted something more, and especially as I started shooting this, I realized that I'm really recoil sensitive, and it's hard for me to hit the broadside of a barn. Just being honest, it is. And so I figure having more rounds to give me more chance of actually hitting what I'm going for is a good thing. And still looking at all the options out there now, I actually know a little bit more about how CZ is and how CZ operates, and I realized that I actually really like the concept behind their guns. Yeah, they are a lot of times a little on the heavier side, but it really does help with recoil management. They are fairly pleasant guns to shoot, very shootable guns for handgun, and that nice high slide makes it very safe around your hand. You don't have to worry about a lot of slide bite and things like that. Overall, really a pleasant experience. And so I said, I want something a little bit more serious, a little bit more beefy, greater round capacity. I'm going to go with CZ again. And so I got the P09. And this model comes with some extended magazines as well. Not greatly extended, just a little base plate extension. But it gives you a couple more rounds, and it brings the total to the rounds you can carry in this one to 21. Now, I usually only load it to 20 because my boxes of defensive ammo come in little boxes of 20, so that's all I usually worry about. But 20 rounds in this. And I actually found out, because of how the tang on this one is shaped, just like the CZ75, it does have a tang, but this one is this one right here, this one is a much more ergonomic tang than this one. This one's very thin in profile and it tends to dig into you. This one, a little bit wider, and it's shaped a little bit differently. As you can see, it actually flares upwards a little bit more, and it actually turns out it's quite a bit more comfortable. Now, when I hold it in my hand, it's not quite as comfortable for one-handed shooting as my CZ75 is. For a one-handed shot, man, that's hard to beat. That just feels good in the hand, and everyone that I've handed this off to, one of the things that they might not like 9mm and all those other things, like my dad, for example, he's not a 9mm fan, he likes 45. But the one thing that even he had to agree on is, the handle on that's pretty good. And he's right, it is pretty good. This one doesn't have that same kind of handle. It's still good, but as far as a one-handed use, it's not actually very comfortable. But for a two-handed grip, then you start seeing where this one is actually very comfortable. And yes, this one has been cleared too. But you start seeing where it is much more comfortable with a two-handed grip. It's kind of a wide handle, but that gives me plenty of space to palm and wrap. Still has a little pad there for my finger to wrap around on. And man, it's just excellent. Two-handed. Not very comfortable one-handed, frankly. Not as comfortable as the 75. But the P09 for two-handed shooting, it's actually very ergonomic, and it is kind of on the heavy side. Even though this is a polymer frame gun, this one actually weighs about the same as the all-metal one does. So take that for what it is. But it does make it a very pleasant shooter. And because the tang shape is a little bit different, this one's actually easier to carry. But that's also when I discovered something about CZ that I found out that I didn't like. And that is, on CZs, the firing pin has a little retaining pin through it, and you can see a little hole there. Inside of that hole there's a little retaining pin. And when you dry fire a CZ, what happens is the firing pin gets arrested on that little cross pin that goes through. And the cross pins that they send out with it are these little hollow things. They're just little roll pins that they stick in there. And if you're doing live fire with the gun, it's not a big problem because the firing pin strikes the back of the round. It strikes the primer, and there's not a whole lot of force that is actually put on that retaining pin. But if you're dry firing and you don't do it with any kind of dummy round in the chamber or anything like that, all the force is instead going onto that retaining pin, and they wind up breaking. And I guarantee you that I definitely dry fire these things much more than I live fire them. Probably like 4 or 5 times as much dry fire as live fire. And that's really hard on these things. And so on my P09, I broke the retaining pin. I also wound up breaking the return spring as well. And so I had to order parts for it, and it's actually pretty easy to get CZ parts, I found out. There's a company, I think it's out of Arizona, called CZ Custom, and that's all that they do, is they specialize in doing custom work on CZs, and they'll also ship you out parts. You'll have to pay for them, of course, but they'll ship out parts, and one of the parts that they make is a solid, not a hollow little roll pin, but a solid retaining pin specifically for people like myself who like to do a lot of dry fire practice. So you can stick one of those in there. It does a fantastic job of retaining the firing pin, and it's very durable. Lots of dry fire on this one. And I've already checked to make sure that it's clear, but I'm just checking again. Go ahead on that one, and you can dry fire it all day with no problems with that new retaining pin put in there. Now, as I said before, my 75, I'm being a little bit gentle with it because the guts and the slider have been taken out because its firing pin finally broke too. That's just the nature of the beast. If you dry fire a lot with a CZ, you're going to have to replace that little retaining pin. It's easy enough to do, but you are going to have to do it if you do a lot of dry fire. If you don't do a lot of dry fire, it's not going to matter and the thing will last forever. But if you do a lot of dry fire, yep, and it might be one of the things just as soon as you get the gun to invest in. But aside from that issue, aside from the retaining pin issue, and also the return springs on CZs can be a little bit weak, but again, very easy to fix and by yourself with some basic tools, you know, a basic punch set and a few basic gunsmithing tools, nothing fancy. You know, the Lyman sets, the Lyman punches, and the Lyman little screw sets, that's basically all you need. Not bad at all. Good tools they have. Very simple design. Easy to get into. You can modify everything on a CZ. It works. It's good to have that way. And aside from that one particular issue, the retaining pin, they have been fantastic guns. And I really like the operation. I like double to single action guns, and this is a double single action as well. This one doesn't have a safety, although you can swap, although it does come with a safety and you can install it if you want to. But this one I leave in just normal double action mode. When you go to load the gun the first time, it'll go, of course, push the hammer all the way down, hit the button on the side. It will decock the gun for you, which means that it's going to bring the hammer up like it just did, but it doesn't bring it all the way forward, because then that would set off the gun, and we don't want that. But instead it brings it to kind of just this little half-cock position, the semi-cock position. And what that does is it makes the trigger very hard to pull, especially on this one. The P09 has one of the heaviest double action pulls I've felt on any gun. This one's double action pull isn't too bad. I think it's somewhere around 8 pounds. This one definitely tips the scales. It's like a 10 to 12 pound, depending on the individual gun that you get. It's like a 10 to 12 pound pull for its double action. Very, 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 very stiff trigger pull for that double action. And people ask, you know, why would you want to make it harder to pull the trigger? Well, it's kind of a safety feature. It's not a safety feature like you have on the 75. 75, bring the hammer back, and then the safety on the other side, you move into position, and it basically locks up the hammer so that it can't do anything. Pull it off, and it's a pretty light trigger after that. And in double action mode, like I said, it's about an 8 pound trigger. It's not super light, but it's also not super heavy either, and it's also a very smooth trigger as well on the CZ75. Like I said, the trigger on the CZ75 reminds me a lot of a revolver trigger, which I like. On the P09 though, it is much, much harder. Like I said, it's usually closer to a 10 pound, sometimes going up to a 12 pound trigger pull. Very, very, very stiff, very long, and also kind of stagey. But when you actually start getting out and shooting this thing, the staginess and those kinds of things don't wind up mattering as much. And then in single action, it's actually really, really a nice trigger. So you've got a little bit of pre-travel, and you've got some resistance, and there isn't really any perceptible wall before the break. It's just pre-travel, then you get resistance, and it breaks, and there's not any significant stacking before it. It's just pre-travel, resistance, and then it goes off. And then as far as the reset is concerned, okay, sorry. As far as the reset is concerned, it is kind of a long reset, and that's because this is their duty model. It's not to be a competition gun or super rapid fire. It's meant to give you a little bit more pause, and it actually does a good job of that. So, taking it out, so that's about a 1/4 inch travel, and then you're back into it. It's not bad. I personally don't like how straight that trigger is by comparison to the CZ75. I actually really like the trigger in the CZ75, but this one I can get used to. It's not that bad once you get used to it. And as you'll notice, this one comes with some high sights, and these sights are actually Tritium sights. They're night sights, and they come from came from the factory like this. CZ has really started to do some really cool things right from the factory that are great. So this one came with tritium night sights, and it's the high tritium night sights, so that in case you want to put a suppressor on it, you can without having to mess with getting new sights, because a lot of times when you put a can on it, you can't see over the can, so you need to get new sights for it. Well, this one comes with new sights, and it also has a threaded barrel on it. Again, suppressor ready. And like I said, this one did come with a extended base plate on the magazines to give you a couple extra rounds capacity. And this was about a $600 gun with all of the added amenities on it. Not bad in my book. And this one also is nice in that the space behind the chamber is big enough that you can just look inside of it and see very easily whether or not the gun is loaded. And I like to be able to do that, so I can just turn the gun sideways, look down into the chamber, does it have a round in it or not, and be good. Now I'm still OCD, and I still pull the slide back and all those kinds of things. And you'll notice that it has forward serration and rear serrations, so that if I want to do a front press check, it's pretty easy to do without any great problems. But yeah, terrific gun. It was a pain that the retaining pin on it broke, but again, very simple fix. The lineman set of punches and the little screwdriver set is really all that you need, and some kind of a surface to work on. You might get a vise, but you don't absolutely need it for those kinds of things. And a little bit of Loctite to lock it in place once you get it in there, but other than that, not bad. It is a pain though. With me, I do a lot of dry fire, and so for me, I like CZs. I like that they have that nice high slide. They're fairly heavy in the market, which is bad for carrying, I freely admit, but it's really nice when you're out on the range. If you're new to handguns, seriously think about getting a CZ. They are heavy, but that makes them much more pleasant when you're actually shooting them terrifically. And the price range for CZs is not usually bad. $500 to $600 will get you a fantastic CZ. And yeah, no complaints about it that way. I wish that they wouldn't put the little stupid roll pins in. I wish they would start with just the solid pins that I usually wind up upgrading to. Well, now I upgrade to. But other than that, man, it's not a bad thing. And then I found out that CZ not only makes handguns, and most companies out there will make more than one thing, but I found out in particular that they make 9mm carbines. And yes, this one has been cleared as well. But since I'm OCD, I'll go ahead and check on it again. Yes, and it is clear. I don't know how well you guys can see that, but yes, it is clear. Obviously, no mag either. But they make carbines. And this is their Scorpion, the Scorpion Evo 3 or whatever they call it. Evo Scorpion 3. No, I think it's the Evo 3. But anyways, Scorpion. We'll go by that. And this was expensive in comparison to the handguns. This is about $1,000, whereas their handguns are usually about $500. And this, again, is 9mm. That's a lot of what I shoot is 9mm when it comes to center fire. Just because 9mm is fairly cheap to shoot. It's almost always in stock in one form or another. You can always get a hold of it. And very simple operation, not an overly powerful round, so you don't get a whole lot of kick, all that. It's a good, decent round. It's big enough to get the job done when it comes to self-defense and home defense. But it's also really inexpensive compared to pretty much anything. Any other center fire round that's out there is almost always going to be more expensive than 9mm. Now that can change a little bit when you're talking about like aluminum case ammo or steel case ammo, things like that. Sometimes we'll change the cost dynamics around a little bit. But brass case to brass case, 9mm pretty much beats everything. And so that's why I do a lot of 9mm. It's inexpensive. It's a good plinking round. If you're going to plink with center fire, 9mm is the way to go. But got this. It's about $1,000, and I've now put quite a few rounds through it. We'll say several hundred rounds, and it just functions perfectly. And this is one thing I've noticed about all of my CZs is that they will run just about any kind of ammo that you can find to put in them. They'll take even the really weak stuff like S&B, Selector and Bellot. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Some people pronounce it like 30 different ways. But Selector and Bellot, is the way I've heard people from that company pronounce it, and so I'm assuming they know, so I'm just going to go with that. Seller and Bellot is actually a fairly weak 9mm round. You can chronograph test it, compare it to others, and it's almost always the slow one. And typically on a gun, the slower that it is, the less it's going to, less likely it is it's going to be able to operate the gun successfully. But CZs are made in the same country that S&B is. They're both Czech companies, and the handguns come with little targets in them. They're computerized targets that shows you what the test target was, but they'll tell you what the ammo that they used on there, and it was S&B, which is one of the weakest mass-produced loads out there that you can find in 9mm, and that's what they use to test these things on. So it can run really weak ammo, but they're also pretty much every single one that I've ever seen, especially any of the new stuff. I don't know about back in the day and some of the really old CZs that are on the market, because CZs have been around, at least the CZ75, not this particular model, but CZ75s have been around since 75. That's where they get the name from. So they've been around for a good long while, and I'm not sure about the old ones. But any of the newer guns that I've seen on the market are all plus P rated. So they can take really weak loads, like the S&B stuff, and they can take, pretty much the hottest load that you want to put in them that's, any kind of manufacturer would actually certify. No manufacturer certifies the plus B plus stuff, but plus B, they do just fine on. And like I said, I've fed pretty much everything through them. I've fed the S&B stuff through them. I've done the Remington training ammo, which is also fairly weak. Remington green and white box. I've done the Hornady American Gunner 124 plus Ps in them. I've also done the Fort Scott Munitions 115 grain and 80 grain 9mm offerings, and it runs everything. It just doesn't matter. These things will run it all. And this gun in particular is actually pretty decently fun. It's a little bit lighter than some other 9mm carbines, like my Tavor. My Tavor is a 9mm carbine, and it's a little on the heavier side. It's about 8 pounds. This one's only about 6.5, so there's more perceived recoil on this one, but it's not bad. It's not prohibitive. And I've actually found out that it's decently accurate. I'm not super accurate with it, but other people that I've shot with have been able to maintain fantastic groups with this thing, especially with the right load. The American Gunner 124 plus Ps, very accurate load, and out of this gun, for me at least, you can get a pretty tight group on it at, any reasonable range that you'd use a 9mm carbine, say 25 yards, 50 yards, something like that. Put it out to an 8-inch target, and you can hit the bullseye ring, which is about 2.5 inches across, every time very easily. And one person that I was shooting this with was pretty much able to hit on the bullseye every time, as long as he was able to get off good trigger presses. So yeah, not bad. And there's lots of people that have these now and use these now, and for the most part, positive things. There are a couple of downsides though that do bear mentioning. For one, the handle is not in and of itself the most ergonomic. It's very functional, but not the most ergonomic. A really big detractor is the safety selector. The safety selector, when it's down, it really digs. I don't know if you can see it, but it can really dig into your trigger finger there. When it's off, it's not really in the way. It's not a big deal. But when you take it off safe to fire it, yeah, it's going to dig into you. And it is an ambi one, so it's going to dig onto you on the other side as well. Now, one nice thing about it, though, is that you can use both sides to operate it, and so that does make it a little bit easier to work with, but it's still kind of a pain. Another thing I also found with it is, because I tend to over-lubricate my guns, when this thing is firing, it kind of tends to spit lubricant out at you, and even just in handling it here, I managed to get a little bit on myself. But I'm pretty sure that won't kill me. Unless you're in the state of California, then everything just becomes totally cancerous there, and you'll die instantly. But still, very quality gun, Very accurate gun. Like I said, it can feed just about anything. This gun is super easy to take apart. I've done that in other videos and clean. It is just crazy easy that way. And it's managed to convert some people. Not out of Christianity. But it has managed to convert some people who originally didn't like it. There's one person that I know that I showed it to in picture form before we went out and shot it. And when he looked at the picture, he didn't like it. He said, "Oh, it's ugly." And then he gets out there and he starts shooting. He's like, "That's not bad." And it actually became his favorite 9mm carbine. And that, I think, is the thing that excites me the most about CZs. CZs are actually very user-friendly guns. There are some quirks, like weird safeties, or retaining pins that don't do well with dry firing. So there are some quirks, but aside from those quirks, they're actually really great guns. And like I said, very easy to use. Taking down a CZ is, a CZ handgun, for example, it's not quite as easy as taking down a Glock, but it's not hard either. It's a pretty simple takedown system. Pretty easy to figure out how everything works in one. And if I can take it apart and replace retaining pins and things like that, and I'm not overly mechanical, not overly smart, don't have a garage full of just thousands upon thousands of tools. If I can manage to do it, then pretty much anyone can. Okay. But yeah, very simple guns, very easy to use, very user-friendly. Like I said, that nice high slide that they have makes it so that it's really hard to mess up your grip on. When you can hold a CZ just about any way that you like, and you're going to be safe. They're kind of goof-proof. I'm not saying that as a challenge, though, because some people will take it like that. But still, pretty user-friendly, and the fact that they're single double action gives you that extra safety feature without actually having a full safety that you have to defeat. You still overcome it by pulling the trigger. It's just harder to pull the trigger, which means that the trigger is less likely to go off, if it gets caught on clothing and stuff like that. And another thing that I really like about hammer guns is that when you're going to holster them, you can put your thumb on the hammer, and as you're holstering it, you can feel if there's any pressure on the trigger, because if there's pressure on the trigger, it's going to bring that hammer back. And you can say, "Hey, something's catching on the trigger." Pull back out, reassess. On a striker-fired gun, you can't do that. If you put your thumb behind a striker-fired gun and it happens to catch on something, all you're going to wind up with is a sore thumb from when the gun goes off, and possibly an injury to your leg or something like that, wherever you happen to be carrying. Hammer gun, though, feel that hammer coming back, I know something's up, I can stop doing what I'm doing that's going to result in a discharge and take care of the issue. Can't do that with striker fire. Makes these guns very, very, very safe, being able to put them into double action mode with the hammer forward, not all the way forward, but to the semi-cock position, Still can feel if the hammer's moving, and does a terrific job at what it's supposed to do. Makes it a very safe gun to operate, and like I said, they do usually come in on kind of the heavy side, but when you're shooting them, that makes for less recoil. Now, either of those might not be great options for you. If you want something that you're going to be everyday carrying all the time, a full metal CZ75 compact might not be a great idea, because the gun itself is about 2 pounds. You put a loaded magazine in there, and you're talking about a 40-ounce gun. It's pretty heavy. And the P09 is about the same. It's also about a 40-pound gun. Not 40 pounds, that would be a big gun. But about a 40-ounce gun when it's fully loaded. And stock, and without the magazine, I should say, it's also about 2 pounds. But they do make a smaller version of this called the P07 that does weigh a little bit less, but still kind of heavy, which is still good for being able to get shots off, but not quite as heavy, so it's a little bit more manageable to take around with you. That might be an option to look at. Yes, you will have some of the same issues with the retaining pin issue, and it's one of those things that if you plan on doing a lot of dry firing, just go ahead and order a solid retaining pin from CZ Custom, and they will ship it out to you, provided you pay them, of course. And like I said, pretty easy to replace. If you don't plan on doing a lot of dry firing, though, it's not a big issue. And for most people who own CZs, they never have problems with the retaining pins. I'm just weird because I dry fire all the time. Like I said, I probably dry fire 4 to 5 times more than I do any live fire on these guns. So if anyone's going to find the breaking point on something like that, it's going to be me. And then for those of you guys who are striker fire fans, CZ actually does have a pretty good striker fire model out there right now. It's called the CZ P10C, C standing for compact. And it's about the size of Glock 19. In fact, a lot of Glock 19 holsters will fit it just fine. So you still want to check individually, of course, but a good place to begin looking for a holster for a CZ P10C is Glock 19 holsters, because a lot of them work just fine. But they're also often cheaper than a lot of Glocks. A CZ P10C will usually come in for the base model about $500, whereas the new Glocks are coming in, you know, 500 plus, a lot of them 600. So you can save, you know, anywhere from, you know, $25 to $100 on getting the CZ. And then on top of that, the CZ is actually pretty ergonomic, especially compared to the Glock. CZ is always ergonomic in different ways. Like I said, the CZ75 Compact is my best one-hand gun out there. Once you get one hand solidly around it, it just doesn't feel like it's going to go anywhere. It's great. The P09, not a great one-hand gun, but when you get 2 hands on it and a good firm clamshell, man, you have a solid grip with that. The P10C isn't any different in that regard. I have handled them. I don't buy them because I don't like striker fire guns, but I have handled them. Great handle ergonomics. And then as far as durability and reliability, the CZ P10C has actually beat Glocks in the reliability department. There are CZ P10Cs that have not malfunctioned once in 6,000 rounds plus, whereas most Glocks are manufactured such that their guaranteed rate is basically 1 in 2,000, which is still fantastic. Glock's still good, but CZ tripled that. That's pretty awesome. That's not necessarily every CZ under every condition, and certainly not every model of CZ, but the CZ P10C is actually a very reliable striker-fired model, more so than Glocks, more ergonomic than Glocks, although that doesn't really take much to beat because Glocks are kind of a brick. But more ergonomic, actually typically more reliable, less cost. Yeah, they're really good that way. So what's my opinion of CZ as a company overall? They do have some quirks, like all companies out there. If you are hard enough on any piece of equipment, eventually you'll find a breaking point. And I usually wind up finding them, and I've found breaking points with a lot of different companies. Smith & Wesson usually considered pretty good, but on my 1522, which is not their hallmark of reliability gun, but still it's a Smith & Wesson, had problems with the pin that holds in the hammer. It started wiggling out and the hammer was in there kind of sideways doing weird funky things, and so I had to straighten that out. Again, call for Loctite. Loctite is a great thing if you own a lot of guns. But had that happen with the Smith & Wesson, and you guys probably also know about a lot of the issues that I've had with Kel-Tec. I actually still like my Kel-Tecs to a great extent. And by the way, I got my RDB working. It's functional now. It's not great, but it's at least functional now, which it was not before, so that part is at least as good. We'll see how things go, but I was able to get 150 rounds, well, not 150, 145 rounds through it. And I didn't have any light primer strikes on it, finally. I've been having issues with that in the past, but that issue seems to have been resolved. I still have problems with the charging handle getting stuck on the gas piston. I've found workarounds to get around that. Really wish I didn't have to, but such is the nature of the beast. Every company, from low-end companies like Kel-Tec, and yes, they are a low-end company, to higher-end companies like Smith & Wesson, they're all going to have their quirks and things that you have to look out for, and if you run any of the guns long enough, hard enough, you will eventually find something on it that breaks. And so the fact that the retaining pins on the CZs keeps breaking on me doesn't bother me that much. It's something that I can replace myself. It's something that now I know about and can find ways to work around it. And so, yes, it is disappointing. Yes, it is annoying. But it doesn't keep me from liking the company. Like I said, it's easy to fix, and once you get the solid retaining pin in there, you don't have the issue again. So it's not like you're sitting there thinking in the back of your mind, oh, I'm going to have to wait for it to go bad again. It's not. It's just not. You put in a solid retaining pin, it's going to be solid. The reason why they have problems at all is because they use the little roll pins, the little hollow roll pins. So you put in the solid ones, it's not an issue. It's easy to do yourself. And then some of their guns don't have that kind of operation in them. This one is not a handgun, so it doesn't have a slide to have that kind of a retaining pin in it. It does have a firing pin in it, of course, but it's not the same kind of a system. And also this one, I don't dry fire a whole lot. I dry fire it to put it into storage, sometimes to check functionality, but I usually do that with dummy rounds in there, so it's not a real big issue with this one. I'm not really super worried about it. But still, it has its quirks, especially that safety that digs into you. And the handle is not the most ergonomic in the world, but it's not bad. But overall, good guns. Easy to use, easy to clean, a lot lower cost than a lot of their competitors. And just to bring this one back in there, yes, this is a $1,000 gun. But when you consider what its competitors are, that's not bad. Its competitors include things like my Tavor. My Tavor is at least a $1,500 gun. In a lot of areas now, it's closer to a $2,000 gun. This is only $1,000, so I'm saving minimally $500 up to $1,000 getting one of these, and this thing is every bit as reliable as my Tavor is. Okay, and this one's actually probably more accurate, to be honest. The Tavor is a bullpup, and bullpups don't necessarily tend to be the most accurate innately, and then how they interface with the user, that can create more problems. For me, I have a hard time getting a consistent cheek hold on my Tavor, but I can get a very consistent cheek hold on this one. So it's just one of those things you live and you learn with. But yeah, for what you pay, the quality is really good. Like I said, with the CZ P10C, you're basically getting or exceeding lock quality, at least on that particular model, for less money. That's pretty cool. And then in terms of reliability, CZ is a military brand. The Czech Republic has been using it as a military and law enforcement gun for a very long time now, and they are highly successful in those regards. Okay, so they're a military proven company, and a lot of their models are military models. This is semi-auto, it's not full auto, but this one is based on a military model. The military model does not have this big long barrel on it. This is a civilian thing. But this is basically derived, it's not the same, but it's derived from the military gun, and it has those kinds of specs. And so it's going to do what you expect a military type gun to do, and that is primarily be able to last, be simple to use, and if something goes wrong, fairly simple to fix. And CZ does that, and it does that well. Now, if you want something that's, break-proof or something like that, yeah, you might want to think about a Glock. Like I said, the CZ P10C competes very well with the Glock 19, but CZ doesn't really have anything for other calibers or other sizes. So take that for what you will. You can get some upgraded versions of the P10C that have extended magazines and an extended barrel, which would compete with the Glock 17 pretty well, I would say. But beyond that, they don't really interface a whole lot. So if you want like 40 cal or something like that, you want, that full utter reliability, yeah, you might be better off with Glock or SIG. But for most civilian applications, CZs will definitely get the job done. I mean, as long as you know what you're going into them with, and you use them under what you might call normal conditions, not dry firing 4 to 5 times more than live firing like I do, yeah, they'll last minimally 5,000 rounds. And there's lots of stats out there on them that show that they actually last minimally 5,000 rounds. That's a pretty good baseline for a decent quality handgun. Most of them are well over that, of course, but once you start getting past 5,000 rounds, you start talking about needing to do things like replace recoil springs and things like that. And all handguns are like that, by the way. Pretty much any handgun, including Glocks and SIGs, once you get past 5,000 rounds to 7,500 rounds, somewhere in there, you're going to start getting into issues where you need to replace some parts, especially the recoil springs, and that's just part of how things work. Things wear down, and things that move and sustain pressure usually are the things that are going to break first, and that usually winds up being the recoil spring. So that's not anything that's unusual. I'm just saying that expect it, like you would with any gun, expect it. And when you do that, turns out they're actually really great. They do have quirks. There are downsides, and if there's a downside to a gun, I'm going to find it. Yeah, I've managed to break a retaining pin twice. Yeah, I dry fire a lot more than most people do. And that's another myth that's out there. People think that if you dry fire a lot, it's going to ruin the firing pin. It doesn't ruin the firing pin if it's a center fire gun. What it does is it ruins whatever the firing pin rests on. And in this case, it happens to be a little hollow rod that they stuck in there. Yeah, so there's things like that and other quirks and things that you find along the way. But like I said, every company has that. Fairly high-end companies like Smith & Wesson, lower-end companies, of course, like Kel-Tec, they have all kinds of issues. And I still like Kel-Tec. Don't get me wrong. I still like Kel-Tec. But you do kind of have to fiddle with them. Sometimes you have to send them back to a factory. But usually, eventually, if you're willing to stick it out long enough, you can usually get something that's pretty decent at the end of it if you have the time. Yeah, that's just one of the things that you have to take into account. What I like about CZ, though, is that out of the box, they're actually pretty good. And as long as you don't dry fire a lot, they're actually really good. And they'll last just as long as any other gun that's on the market. And usually be able to beat most of the other guns cost-wise. And also much easier to use, and because a lot of them are a single double action hammer fired guns, I actually think they're safer personally. That'll probably start some kind of a fight somewhere, but I like them. And simple systems, easy to get into, they're just really good at what they do. So what is my opinion of CZ as a company? 2 thumbs up. I like them. Yeah, they have their quirks. All companies have their quirks. Even Glock and SIG have their quirks. Yeah, you can get a Glock that's a dud. It's rare, but it still happens. And everybody mentions Glock sights, and yeah, the Glock sights that come standard on their guns are awful. Plastic. Not particularly good sights. A lot of people trade them out as soon as they get them. Yeah, that's one of the advantages of owning guns, especially in America, is you can do upgrades all day long. But CZ is certainly a company that can compete with the so-called big companies like Glock and SIG. Have that kind of reliability if you put it together right. Like I said, the retaining pin issue, but if it's one of those things, you know that there's a retaining pin issue, so you just go ahead and order the parts right away, and then when the parts come in, go ahead and swap it out at that time, because it shouldn't take any more than a month certainly for the parts to get to you, and a lot of times it'll be within a week, and the little retaining pin that they have in there will certainly last for that time period, and you can get a new retaining pin for under $14, including shipping and handling, at least at the time of this video. And so you get the gun for $500, you spend another $14 on a retaining pin, and the gunsmith tools, the very basic gunsmith tools that you would get, the lineman punch set and those kinds of things. Hopefully you kind of want to have those anyways, and so that's something that if you have a decent number of guns at all, you're going to want to have, so might as well invest in it now. Yeah, not bad. And like I said, simple to use, personally in my opinion, safer to use than a lot of other options, like more than striker fired. And like I said, also, even with those added things, usually less expensive than the competition. There's a lot of SIGs out there that are great. They'll definitely last forever, and they're also pretty simple, easy to use, those kinds of things, great guns, but they're also really expensive. You can pay easily $800 plus for a SIG, and I don't want to pay that much. So I would rather get a $520 gun, spend $14 in getting a replacement pin for it, and have something that's going to work just as well. Kind of a no-brainer. That's what I like about CZ. They have very high quality guns at a relatively low price, and yeah, they have their quirks, but you can work around them pretty easily. That's my opinion, at least. Alright, thanks for your time.